I often see it's just one of those things that tends to get kind of squeezed out. When life gets really big and demanding and overwhelming, it just kind of can fall off for some folks. And honestly, for a lot of us, that's a time where we need it most. We need that space and we need a little place for our brain to go into that direction. And we don't always kind of give ourselves the grace, and space that we need.
And I was just like to say, I really like the Rhonda when you point out how it can get squeezed out. And I also think that there's a sense that we box it out, like that creativity has to be separate from other things we do.
You're listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient, brought to you by University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. In this series, we'll explore a variety of well-being topics with experts from the university community in physical, emotional, nutritional, and financial health. Join us, and together we'll discover how we can thrive at work, home, and beyond. Hello there, listener. Welcome to another episode of Becoming Wildly Resilient. I'm your host, Jacob Hester, and I'm pleased you're tuning in. The voices you heard in the opening clip belong to Rhonda Henry and Eric Wilkinson. Both are licensed clinical social workers with Masters of Social Work degrees. They're also two of my University of Kentucky HR colleagues serving as mental health therapists. In this episode, we have an in-depth discussion on creativity. Rhonda and Eric provide lots of useful information throughout, and I love how they're able to tie the topic to many of our previous episodes. Some of what you'll learn includes the 4 types of creativity, how creativity benefits our personal and professional lives, why sometimes we lose sight of our creative capacity, and how we can cultivate more creativity throughout our days. You'll also hear them discuss creative writing and receive 2 starter prompts for exploring writing as a creative practice. But before you get your creative juices flowing, this is your brief reminder to hit the follow button in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss any future episodes. You're the reason I get to do this each month, so I appreciate everyone who's following along and encourage you to reach out with any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Rhonda Henry and Eric Wilkinson. Welcome, Rhonda and Eric. I'm so excited to have you both back on the show.
Thanks for having us, Jacob.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So for those who haven't heard your previous episodes or don't know about the mental health resources available to UK employees, retirees, and spouses, can you give kind of a quick overview of what you all do?
Sure. We are therapists who are based here on campus, and we provide services to all UK employees, no matter whether they're based here on main campus or whether they're out in our rural areas, as well as their sponsor dependents. Folks are able to see us for 5 sessions per year, and that renews every fiscal year. So folks have those 5 additional sessions each year if they need them. And then what we talk about, just like what you would expect in most therapy settings, is going to be private and confidential. So it doesn't become part of their personnel record or their health records at UK. And we can talk about any variety of topics. So those might be work related, but it may relate to home or family, life goals, just a wide variety of things. And we're happy to either, provide those services in-house or help connect them to other ongoing therapy if that's something maybe they need as well.
And what specialties do you all have? Are there any specific mental health topics that you all like to work with most?
When I get asked this question, one of the ways I like to think about mental health is that helping people just deal with the challenges of being human. There are things that we all go through in terms of loss, disappointment, stressful times in our life, times when there's uncertainty, times when there might be a lot of fear and anxiety, and times when we're just trying to figure out how we want to be in the world. So I try to think in things not so much always in terms of diagnostic terms, but just more in terms of the challenges of being human. I also like working with folks that are trying to live a life that really aligns with their values. And so if folks feel like they're out of alignment or that they're struggling in terms of understanding their pathway, and then I just have a lot of experience working with folks with different types of anxiety disorders or struggling with depression.
If folks are interested too, I think in knowing just what all the different therapists' sort of backgrounds are or interest areas are. I think Eric did a great description. I think for all of us that we're all generalists, we're all looking kind of the broad swath of issues that might come up. but there's a little more on our website that does kind of speak to a little of our background or areas of interest in particular. Some of the ones for me that come up, and I've got experience in working in, have to do with those family and relationship issues that might be coming up for folks, life transitions, social and community justice, community trauma issues, things around identity, work life satisfaction. So again, it's a wide swath for most of us that we're interested in. And I think that's one of the great things about working with the UK population is we get to meet folks from all walks of life, that are kind of facing all sorts of different challenges.
Yeah, I'll link to that in the show notes so you can get to know the therapist, because I know that's kind of you have to kind of have that relationship there, right? With the
Yeah.
person that you're working with. Sometimes it's not a right fit. So kind of knowing a little bit of information up front can help you out, I'm assuming. So I have a segment that I always do at the beginning too, just kind of like an icebreaker type of thing. I've got a deck of conversation starters. I pull one out at random, and then all of us will answer it. And none of us know what the question is ahead of time. So Eric, a bunch of these lately have been related to music. So there's a decent chance we'll get another music one if we stay on the trend that we've been going. But we'll see what we get here. What's your proudest accomplishment?
Jacob, that's a really big, heavy question at the beginning of this. Dang.
That's the deepest one I've pulled out yet.
Yeah, you were having me set for music. Like I thought I was going to get like, what song gives me energy? Shoot, proudest accomplishment. Eric, feel free to jump in if you've got one that comes straight to mind.
I think I'm gonna answer that in a general sense. Folks that know me well often share with me that they find me to be really authentic. So I look at I try not to attach very much to past accomplishments, to be honest with you, because I like to embrace what I'm doing in the present, and I also feel like when we attach to our past accomplishments, that can be really limiting in terms of how we interact with what's going on in our lives currently, or it can be limiting in terms of how we use our imagination and thinking about what we want to do going forward. So, proudest accomplishment, I think it would just be the way that I conduct myself with other humans.
That's good. I like that.
I like that. It's a hard one to follow up, Eric. I'm going to go with one that may feel a little non-traditional for me, but I think is true. When I've walked away from things that were not meant for me, when I was able to recognize things that were just not serving my life and chose to forge a different path. And those were hard times, but those were moments I'm really proud
Mine's going to sound like a cliche answer, I think, but
of.
being a sort of new dad with a toddler, I mean, for me, that really has been one of the most, fulfilling and kind of large accomplishments I think that I've had in my life. I think I might have, chosen some more vain things prior to having a kid. So my priorities and things like that have definitely shifted. Just seeing him, giggle and smile every day is really kind of reminds me of that purpose and of that accomplishment of getting by as a parent.
It's such an important part of life. So, I mean, it definitely deserves some of that attention and pride for sure.
All right, so let's jump into our topic today on creativity and creative writing. So I recently read the book Rest by Alex Sujung Kim Pang. And in it, he focused on ideas like creativity and writing and productivity. And that really kind of sparked an interest for me in that connection between the creative process and our well-being. So I knew you all would be great to bring back on the show for this topic, since you all have been hosting some creative writing workshops over the last year or so. So let's basically start by talking about creativity more broadly, because I think it's a concept that we talk about and tout so often that we just assume that everybody knows what we're talking about or what it means. So I suspect that individuals may have, they may view it differently or have a different definition of creativity or something like that. So let's really kind of start there. What's the more formal definition? And then how would you each describe it out in the real world?
I think to me, sort of the basic definition of it that I use anyway is about using our imagination to explore or produce. Letting imagination come into whatever we're facing to explore, think about, solve problems, produce new things, whether those are items, that someone has written or painted or created in those ways, whether that's solutions to problems that are going on or, innovative ideas that are going on. But I think it has that imagination quality to me to bring it into creativity. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I think I agree that the imagination part is really central to creativity. And in a simple way, I like to think about it, it's any time we put two or more things together in a new way or a novel way. So whether that's ideas or material objects, or whether it's visual images, or just if we try to do a work or a play process differently, anytime we put things together in a new way. But I think Rhonda's emphasis on just tapping into our imagination is probably the most central element of creativity.
Yeah, I like how you kind of simplifying it down to just like bringing two things together in a new or a novel way. When I think about how creativity is sort of perceived, there's like this idea, I guess, that like creativity has to be completely novel. And I don't think that's really the case, right? That like we have all these inputs, and those create some sort of output. So I like the way that you put that of like bringing two things together in a novel way. So they could be things that you've drawn inspiration from. So yeah, that's an interesting way to kind of think about creativity from a really broad sense. But you mentioned sort of elements of creativity. Are there other elements to it?
I think that one of the things about creativity is that I think it's this slowing down enough to kind of tune in to your experience and allowing your imagination to arise spontaneously. Like I think spontaneity is a big part of it. Sometimes you'll see, our culture is really big on, how to do manuals or protocols. And I think the creative process is this idea of let me be curious. So I think curiosity is a core part of it. Let me be curious about either the world or about some part of myself or about relationships or others. And then let me be curious, and then let me kind of allow the imagination to play around with what is interesting me in a really kind of organic, spontaneous way.
And Jacob, if I can mention, one of the things that I found interesting, there's a framework, I feel like so many ways to look at this. And we can look at it through all these different lenses. And one framework that's out there was put together by this neuropsychologist, Dietrich, and he's got these four categories of creativity. And I'm going to go through the four really quick because I think for me, it just really helped, as we're going to talk about our writing workshop in a little bit. But as we've thought about some of those things, this is some of the background that I was thinking through and reading through just to wrap my head around kind of what we were wanting to do with that. And the four categories he kind of breaks this into are deliberate cognitive, deliberate emotional, spontaneous cognitive, and spontaneous emotional. Let me give you the four examples he gives, because for me, the examples like made it super clear. So for deliberate cognitive, he gives the example of Thomas Edison, someone who did experiments. He had lots of information, kind of like Eric was talking about. It wasn't all new information. It was taking information he had and putting it together in all these different ways to try to solve a problem or come up with something. The other one that he goes to is the spontaneous cognitive. And the example he gives with that one is Newton and the apple. And so that idea that it's a spontaneous moment, but he's still using all this knowledge that has internally to, again, put together things, solve things, come up with explanations. Then he shifts into the emotional deliberate. And his example there was therapeutic interventions, things like Eric and I do. When we're talking with someone and we're helping them take, again, information they may have internally, think about it through a different lens or put it together in different ways. And then that fourth area for the way he categorized it was the emotional spontaneous. And that's where he groups things like musicians, painters, artists in those ways. And I think for me, it really struck me that I think a lot of us, and myself included, we only think of that emotional spontaneous as the artistic, creative sort of piece of things, but really giving ourselves the chance to remember that all these different pieces or all these different sort of spots in that framework allow us creativity in different ways. And I think to me, it really speaks to Eric's kind of earlier answer about putting things together in these novel ways. It doesn't always have to be something brand new that was never existing before. It can also be a new way of looking at it or putting it together.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest light bulb moment I had reading the book Rest was that it like he basically goes through and gives examples of folks like Thomas Edison, like
Yeah.
these people you think about throughout history and the works that they've created or the science that has come out of the work that they've done and how they went about it. And he really basically describes like they all worked as a practice. Basically, it wasn't just always spontaneous for them. There were moments of spontaneity in that, but they basically treated it like a practice. So they started work to get inspiration rather than getting inspiration and then starting to work. And so that's how they found sort of that longevity in however they, applied that creative pursuit. So I thought that was really, really interesting to me. So it kind of makes me think about this idea of like the muse. So I think if we kind of think about the classic creativity and like the muse coming to speak to you, I don't know if he mentions this in the book, but this is kind of how I see it, at least, is that like the muse needs to know where you are. So if you're kind of doing these things and treating it as a practice, then the muse knows where to find you a lot easier, so that it's not always, you're not relying just on spontaneity. There's a bit of a practice
Yeah.
to the act of creativity.
On that idea of kind of creating space for it, creating a moment.
Mhm.
I think, Eric, you may have mentioned this word or phrase earlier, that idea of sort of multitasking and things that come at us in this world, that if we don't create some space for that muse to visit, it gets really hard to sort of hear it in the midst of all the chaos of the day.
Yeah, and I think that one other thing that you both highlighted is that when you have that structure, or like that there's intentional engagement, that creativity is an iterative process, right? That there's a coming back to things, that there's a trying things multiple ways, that it's not a just you just get a burst of inspiration. And my primary outlet creatively is writing, and I think about how so much of the writing process is the editing process, and it's the coming into and building back up. So, like this idea of intentional practice, as you indicated, Jacob, and this realization that it's ongoing and iterative.
And then, yeah, those sparks of creativity are often too like it's basically because your brain is working on some of these problems in the background when you do then go step away from it. So that was one of the interesting tips that I took away from the book too, where that like you can leave a problem, you don't have to continue to work it. That like if you take a step away, your brain's actually going to take over. You go do something else, and it's so that idea. The whole book is about rest, and purposeful rest, and making it kind of an active process, and what it does to things like creativity and productivity. And so like your, the default mode network in your brain is working in the background to make these connections, to bring those two elements together in that unique and novel way. And so that's why I think we get those shower thoughts, or, walking and the light bulb goes off, those types of moments. So that it's interesting to kind of see how these different elements of creativity work together as well to help you come up with those new and novel ways. Again, however you're applying that, whether that's, art or in the workplace or something like that. So I feel like creativity is also talked about primarily as kind of like this innate trait that we, either have or don't have. Is this true?
I personally don't see that as an innate trait in those ways. I mean, I think, to me, it's a place where I think growth mindset can serve us well in thinking about this. How do we try new things? How do we cultivate things? And I think there are many things, even some of the ones we've already started to refer to today, that sort of set the stage, for creativity. And I think, honestly, for a lot of folks, what I find is we get in our own way. We have preconceptions about what creativity means, how it's expressed, what environment it comes in, what it means for the muse to visit us, and I think sometimes only look at the end product of other people and kind of measure ourselves against that. Well, I can't come up with that great idea right now. Well, that took a lot of creative work, maybe to get to that idea. And so I think there are ways definitely to cultivate it and to grow that and to exercise, that part of ourselves. And the more we access it, the more effective we're going to be in trying to use it in those different parts of our lives. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I think I like the emphasis about that accessing it. I think it's innate in the sense that I think creativity is what makes us human. Like we're the one species on Earth that we know can bring into our mind something that doesn't exist, or something that doesn't exist in a certain way, and then bring it into existence. So I think that we all have the capacity for it. I think it's like a core part of our humanity. But I also think that the more that you engage with the creative parts of your brain, or you engage within creative parts of yourself, the easier you're able to access it. It's like you nourish it. And so I think it's both, you know, um, it's an innate capacity, but it's something that we do have to nurture if we want to have it to be expressed fully.
Yeah, I like that connection to growth mindset and thinking about it not necessarily in terms of like competition. And it is about the process. And then I like, Eric, how you talked about it as being like a capacity for folks. So inevitably with most things, somebody's going to have kind of a higher baseline than someone else potentially with creativity. They may just be able to tap into that a little bit easier based on some other previous experiences they've had, or the way that they were, raised or anything like that. But we all have the ability to get better at it. And that's where it ties back to that growth mindset, and it being a process too, and something we can continue to work on. And I think, like you said, it can be sort of self-limiting when you think about it in the terms of like, oh, I'm not a creative person. I don't know how many times I've heard somebody say, oh, I'm not a creative person. I'm like, in reality, we're all creative in some way.
Mhm.
It just may not be in that traditional, like, I'm not David Bowie. Like,
Exactly.
I'm not Prince. Like, I don't have this output that they have. I'm not Picasso. But my creativity shows up in problem solving. I think that's where I sort of thrive, and I have to use creativity in a different way. And maybe I try to use art or music or something like that just to practice creativity in a different way. So this is kind of a curious question. I actually didn't have this one written down. Where do you all feel like creativity comes out for the two of you all?
I think in a therapy session, if we're going to speak specifically about our professional roles, you're always creating with your client. Like you're interpreting the world with them. You're letting them take the lead, but there's this kind of co-construction. You're interpreting, you're making sense of things. Your creativity arises anytime you engage in perspective taking. You have to, that requires you to imagine wh- what what is this other person feeling, or how are they seeing the world. When you listen deeply, you're able to kind of step outside of yourself and move into a different world that's not your own, that's not just your kind of private world of your mind. And so I think from a mental health perspective is like central to what we do. Outside of that, I think that any time that I can slow down and tune into experience and again become curious, I think those are times that and it can show up in, anyway from just making a joke to like choosing a new path to walk, after work. I mean, it can show up in so many big and small ways.
I would just add for me, I mean, echoing what both of you all said, those both feel very genuine and true to me as well. Just in some practical ways for me, I really have come to a point in life where I realize that if I cultivate some creativity around whatever the situation, I'm probably going to enjoy it more. And whether that comes to, I'm trying to make my office at home more functional. So, what are some creative things I can bring into that are going to make me enjoy that space or enjoy the process? To, I just got a new car. What can I do to personalize that and put my own fingerprint on it? And I really have, I think, really shifted into a point in life that I enjoy, which is how can I bring creativity into this? How can I bring something else into this? Even if it's some of those mundane things that don't feel as exciting to me, I use creativity as more of a motivator, like, okay, if I can make this fun, if I can bring some new sort of twist on it, then I'm going to be more excited about doing the chore I don't want to do, or the thing that doesn't seem as exciting or engaging to me, on a natural basis.
Yeah, I think you all have already drawn connections to our well-being and creativity. So, Eric, I like how you brought up empathy, and that perspective taking is a creative act,
Hmm.
because you having to imagine being in the shoes of that other person, essentially. So I didn't really think about creativity in those terms either. So that's really interesting that you brought that up. And Rhonda, you mentioned things like the joy in the process, or the joy in the result once you're done. Obviously, we've talked about joy and play and those types of things on the podcast in the past as well. So we've kind of established really that it's more or less a skill that we can hone and experience over time in some way. So what else does the research say about the relationship between creativity and our overall sense of well-being, particularly maybe like positive emotion or our ability to flourish or be resilient?
Well, I think one thing that's really clear is that cognitive flexibility increases when we engage in creative process or whatever it is. We can become more flexible in our thinking, which inherently makes us better problem solvers, but again also allows us to access empathy and compassion, take other perspectives. I think that when we engage, if you look at folks that engage in creative process, there's a greater sense of personal agency. and self-efficacy. There's a sense that you can act in this world and that you're not just passive object where things happen to you, but that you can be very active and engaged. So I think that's really important because a lot of times when folks are struggling in terms of their emotional or psychological well-being, it's because they feel like they feel stuck or like that there's no room for action. A lot of times we forget all the ways that we've overcome challenges in the past, and so that enhancing that sense of personal agency is really big. Also, just in terms of why we do the creative writing workshops that we do, and if you think about the creative process within therapy, there's an emotional release, right? There's like sometimes bringing to the conscious awareness what's in our unconscious. There's providing safe space to let yourself feel things and to express those things, which is inherently therapeutic. So those are some of the things I think that, are really, whether you're looking at the neuroscience or whether you're just looking at research around the psychological well-being of creative people, I think they all kind of point in that direction, in those directions.
And your creativity, it activates that part of the brain that lets us process emotion, that lets us kind of get in there and dig into that and open that up. And, I think back to, connecting some of the dots, Jake, you mentioned, some of the past podcasts and things we talked about. And like one of the books I know that we talked about, over the last couple of years was burnout, and being able to calm that nervous system, when we move into a space of burnout, whether it's work related or just our life overwhelming us and feeling burnout. That's one of those interventions is creative activity, to be able to get our nervous system back into a more even sort of regulated space. It's one of those tools that we can tap into. And so I think just on a really practical level, as we're trying to maybe manage emotion in different ways, this can be a really useful tool to bring in, whether on your own or with one of the therapists like me or Eric, to really think about how do we bring in one of these tools and use that as a way of navigating this difficult period I'm trying to process or navigate this next chapter, that's going to be a little more challenging.
Yeah, I think that kind of the other sort of misconception maybe about like creativity is I think you get this perception of like the Kurt Cobains too, where they put out this really great work because they were so emotionally flawed, in air quotes there. And I mean, I think you find kind of time and time again for those types of folks that was their outlet, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be that deeply troubled again, if that's the correct way to even say that. But I mean, you're kind of talking about it as like everyday use for
Hmm.
folks, whether it's through play or something like that, or it is integrated into therapy or
Hmm.
something like that. So there's a lot of different uses for folks, and again, I think we get a lot of like one end of the spectrum or the other, where something like creativity lives across the broad spectrum, right?
Well, and one of the things that I come across, and I don't think that I'm alone in this, and the clients that I see is I'll have clients who will talk about, as we talk to clients, we get to know them, I'll ask questions about, what are outlets for you? Where do you, where if you've got time and you've got resources, where do you go to kind of relax and rest and what rejuvenates you? And people will often talk about creative pursuits that have gotten kind of lost along the way. I used to do this, or when I was younger, I liked this. When I was in school, I liked this, and for a variety of reasons, those things have fallen off. They've not made time for it. They don't feel like they've got the money to do it. They've got other demands. And they've really felt that kind of missing part of themselves. And when we ask about it, it's almost like it's the first time, that for some folks where they're like, oh yeah, that's right. I did used to like to do that. I did used to enjoy that piece back there. And again, some of those just barriers, some are real, some we create for ourselves of can we bring this into today? Can we get reconnected and reacquainted with some of those things? And so sometimes even trying to do that and figuring out, yeah, this thing that you used to like to do may not look the way it did 10 years ago. You may have limitations on time or money or physical ability or whatever's going on, but can we find other ways to kind of reintroduce that? And I just think I often see it's just one of those things that tends to get kind of squeezed out. When life gets really big and demanding and overwhelming, it just kind of can fall off for some folks. And honestly, for a lot of us, that's a time where we need it most. We need that space and we need a little place for our brain to go into that direction. And we don't always kind of give ourselves the grace, and space that we need.
And I was just like to say, I really like the Rhonda when you point out how it can get squeezed out. And I also think that there's a sense that we box it out, like that creativity has to be separate from other things we do. When I come home from work and I walk in, I see my dog and I start to be silly with my dog. I'm being creative. When I'm walking to my car, I'm looking up and looking at different architecture or imagining what things look like. I'm being creative. When I'm bored, I might make up a little song and just start singing a song to myself. I'm being creative. Like it can be seamless throughout your day. Like it can be 30-second bursts of creativity that really go a long way in terms of your physical, emotional health, calming the nervous system. I can get up from a Zoom meeting and do a little 10-second interpretive dance, and I immediately feel better. So it's not like we have to like be like Kurt Cobain and schedule studio time or withdraw from society for weeks on end while we write out our masterpiece. I mean, I think that's great if somebody has the opportunity to really do that deep dive. But I really think like trying not to squeeze it out, trying to welcome it back. You look at how kids are, and they're just constantly making up games, and they're constantly being silly. And I think Rhonda's getting into that with it gets boxed out, it gets excluded. That part of ourselves gets excluded and exiled, and so bringing it back in.
Yeah, as a parent, I can see that with my child. Like every day, everything's so interesting and new and curious. And he's babbling all day long for 20, 30 minutes straight about who knows what. I don't know. You can't understand him. He's not using like words that adults understand, but he's having the grandest time with whatever he's doing
Yes.
with a stick. And I think, yeah, like you said, we either like box it out or we just don't make time for it anymore. And we lose that as we become adults. And I think that's very similar to the way we talked about the idea of like true fun and play when we explored that last year.
Yeah, definitely.
So you talked about basically integrating it into your day. Well, a big part of our days include the workplace or being at work. So how does creativity benefit us at work specifically, individually and collectively?
To me, if we go back to just that kind of core, definition that we sort of tossed around between the three of us at the beginning, you know, to me that fits right, hand in glove with our work. We want to be able to think of things, whether they're things we already know or new novel things that are coming in new and in different ways. And I think back to those kind of four categories. If we create some space, there may be some structure for that where we can come together. Collaboration we know is a big element that can really spark creativity. And whether we call that, brainstorming or what is the storming and forming stuff, that we're doing, being able to be together, have some time, have some unstructured, sort of space to be together and think through things, it lets those novel ideas kind of bubble up. It lets us look at things through those different lenses. And I think, especially when you've got just good, kind of strong working relationships with one another, there's mutual respect for new ideas. We are embracing that growth mindset. We're really encouraging, risk taking in terms of ideas and how we're thinking about things. It sets the stage for it to kind of bubble up.
If we think about brainstorming, right? Again, there's this kind of the sense of let's create something together. So that part of it is important, particularly within a work setting. If you're working as part of a team, this let's create together. I think the intentional seeking out of differences is something that is really valuable. I mean, it may feel good to have someone reflect back your view or your way of looking at the world. That might feel comforting, might create some sense of security or even a feeling of rightness, that I'm right in my views. But I think within a work setting, if you can say, let me ask somebody who I know might have a different view on something than my own, what they think, and be curious. That some really cool creative things often come out of that kind of process.
Yeah, I think that's a direct line back to the previous episode on DEI. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion. That diversity is a huge key part. Having those diverse perspectives allow you to be a little more creative and a little more collaborative and, attend to more people's needs than you might if you were stuck in sort of an echo chamber.
Mhm.
Great. And I think there's also a bonding element that really happens there. I mean, it's fun. We like to be creative. I mean, I think about, us as the four therapists, our little work group. There's rarely something that I enjoy more than when the four of us kind of get on that roll. We're in that headspace. What about this? What about this? Think about this. Maybe we could try this. It's such fun, and, like, we
Hmm.
know what that feels like. Again, your group might be different than my group, but, like, we know what that feels like when you get in that flow state, and you're able to really, like, get yourself kinda lost in that. There's a lot of bonding that happens there because there's also vulnerability that comes with creativity.
Hmm.
If we're filling out things in a new way, well, that's not always going to be, seen as a positive. Somebody may disagree. We can have different opinions. And so it's a place where we build trust, we build bonding, among the group itself. We hopefully, like we are seeing, the best sort of ideas or approaches rise to the top. So we end up with a better work product. But I think the process itself also is really good, just good for our teams, just to be able to come together and have that experience, that collective sort of creative experience is just really refueling for a lot of us.
So, how do we cultivate more creativity in our days, whether that's in our personal life or at work? What tips or strategies do you all recommend?
I mean, I'll just offer one general practice, and then Rhonda, I'll defer to you. But I think this idea of just really tuning in, paying attention to the world, like this, paying attention to your body, your thoughts that are arising, the world around us. This idea of really of tuning in. When you tune into the world and you tune into your sensory experiences, this is one of those times where your mind starts to make associations. Oh, that reminds me of this. That's a creative process right there. When you pay attention to what you're seeing, right? All of a sudden, I see something that I don't normally see. I mean, I'm still always struck by, I can walk the same, it's generally the same path from where I park to my office each day. And yet it's endless how I discover new things on that walk. And so that deep kind of paying attention, I think, is important.
I think, to me, anytime we can think outside the box, and what I mean by that in this situation is not getting stuck in that, it's only got to look this one certain way. It's got to be a paintbrush on a canvas. It's got to be me writing creative words into a poem. But when we can broaden that thought a little bit, because I think if we're limiting ourselves, we can't even get into flow state. We can't even get to the place that is going to feel good and we get that feedback. But looking at it through a different lens, remembering that things like gardening and landscaping and redecorating our house and rebuilding cars and dancing. Like there's all sorts of ways of creative outlets that are out there. And so being willing to sort of have that openness, to how those experiences might show up for us. And then making our interests accessible. So if someone, really likes, maybe they're a quilter and they really like quilting and that's their thing, but they sure don't have room for it and they don't know how to get everything set up and it's going to be way too much time and expense to get all that done. Is there a way to make that in a smaller, more accessible way? Is there a way to bring something that can be done in their living room or at their kitchen table, on a smaller scale? Same thing with work. If I can't do everything in all the ways, can I bring that into this particular meeting? Can we create some space for a brainstorm afternoon where we're doing something to set aside some structure to honestly protect time? Just like we talked about earlier, we've got to make a space for the muse to visit us, if we're going to do this. And so can we create some space, making sure that we've got a brainstorm meeting that actually gives us 2 or 3 hours, that lets us do things like you did at the beginning of the episode where you pulled out, that conversation card. Like we're doing things just to get out of sort of set lockdown headspace and let our brain flow a little bit. And then we're able to invite some of those other ways of thinking in. When I'm working with clients, one thing that I suggest, for those folks that kind of have lost track a little bit of creative things that they've liked, they've gotten squeezed out or boxed out some, is I encourage them, my phrase I use is prime the pump, and part of that is be among your things that you like. If you're somebody who is a visual arts person and you like to paint or play around with, scrapbooking or whatever your thing is, maybe you're not feeling like you can go be your most creative self in that moment, but can you go set among your supplies? Can you go clean out the cabinet that you keep all your stuff stored in? Can we go, read back through old things we've written, revisit an old journal? So we're not necessarily in production mode where we're putting that pressure on ourselves to write the next best thing or, draw the next best thing, but we're letting ourselves engage with our creative brain. We're getting ourselves sort of comfortable back in that space if we've lost touch with a little bit of that stuff that we know we enjoy and we're not able to actually get to as much. And then the other one that comes to mind for me is just space for daydreaming, not being in a place where we're plugged in all the time, letting ourselves be in nature and not have music playing. I say that as someone who loves music and has to make myself do this, not listening to a podcast or not being on the phone every time, letting our brain just play and be. And like Eric mentioned, I think just be present to whatever is going on around us.
Yeah, lots of connection to mindfulness and presence and being open to experiences and those types of things.
Yeah, and I was just going to go back to something that Rhonda was speaking to in an earlier question, but this idea of community, the importance of community. I mean, Rhonda mentioned like going and being amongst things that you enjoy, that get you excited, but also being able to be around people that share interests, whether it is interest in nature or academic interests or, you know, it could be any kind of hobby or interest. When you are around others that you can share joy in whatever that endeavor is, I think that that is also a way of just kind of reconnecting to the things that make us want to create.
Yeah, I think jumping back to the rest book as well, he had an idea in there that was common among writers specifically, was to like leave ideas unfinished.
Mhm.
Like you kind of hit a point where you can see the finish line, and instead of crossing it for the end of the day because it feels good to just check it off the list and be like, I'm done, I don't have to think about this anymore. The way that your brain works, it might actually benefit you to kind of leave that sentence unfinished. And then you come back to it the next day when you start that practice all over again. And there's sort of two benefits to it. Obviously, your brain is continuing to work on that in the background as you rest, sleep, those types of things. But then when you come back to it, you also have a great starting point. And it doesn't seem overwhelming because all you have to do is finish the sentence rather than start a whole new one. So that was something that really stuck out to me from the book, as like a tip to kind of help you with creativity.
But I just think about the broader creative problem solving we've been talking about too. How often do we notice that's good for us to step away from a problem, sleep
Mhm.
on it, get some perspective, step away, talk to somebody. I mean, all of those things that give our brain just a little more chance to not be its most efficient in terms of do it fast, get the check mark, but let me sit with this. Let me think about this. There might be more to ponder here. There might be more layers in this. And I think it's exciting when we let ourselves have that space and then we see that benefit, and remember that, like, oh yeah, that's right. That's why I gave this a little more time. I love that example from the book.
Which transitions kind of nicely into capping this conversation off, talking about writing specifically, because I know this is a passion for you all. And as we've mentioned, you all are doing creative writing workshops. So, why is writing a good creative outlet for folks? And maybe what sets it apart from, other creative pursuits?
Yeah, so I think it encourages reflection, right? Like a deep reflection and an active participation in how we represent the world and represent ourselves. And so when we do that, when we write, you know, we tune inward and we tune outward. So we look inward on what's going on with us internally, things that maybe we've been ignoring or not giving time or space for. A lot with creative writing process, we'll give a simple prompt usually, and then we'll usually have short periods of writing where we encourage folks to not worry about punctuation or form or spelling, but just to kind of write within that time. So a lot of times things that are kind of in the background of our minds or in our unconscious come to the conscious surface. So we discover things every time we write and we represent either experiences in the world or present parts of ourself. I like to think about it as the self is expanding, like it's getting bigger. And so there's this kind of inherent growth when we represent the world or represent our experiences. I also think that there's just a real value in not letting things, I'm going to paraphrase this quote, but in another country, James Baldwin references that when we keep like these deep sources of pain or sources of shame locked within us, it becomes like a dungeon in which we perish. And so, as difficult as it might be, shining light on painful experience is part of the healing process. It's part of the connecting to other human beings who maybe have suffered in a similar way, of allowing yourself to be seen and heard. In the spaces and the creative writing workshops we have folks that have no background in writing, and then we have folks that have extensive background. And it's just a really supportive community where people can feel safe, represent themselves, to represent the world, to learn new things about themselves, to try out new ways of being.
I think you said that beautifully. Just adding to it that one of the favorite parts that I have in our workshop is the sharing component. When folks are invited to share, they're not obligated to share. Folks can write on their own and choose not to share. But when they do, seeing folks read their own words
Mhm.
and seeing the response to that. I mean, every single time we do one of these, we get to the end of that hour, and Eric and I both, we do our little debrief at the end. And we're like, "Oh, that was great! Like that was fantastic!" And the sharing was so powerful because I think for so many of us, a lot of us go through this world and we're not really heard. We're not attended to, and to have other people who have just done this experience, even in this short little 1 hour block, and to have folks attend to that for a few seconds and listen and respond to those words you've written, it is incredibly powerful. And that sharing component and community component, I just think is where the magic lives in it.
Yeah, sparking connection, right? And then the ideas that get shared within that too may spark a new idea for someone else in that group too. So I love that. And I've sat in on a couple of those as well. And really enjoyed them. So, what would you say to those who feel like they aren't good at writing? Because you mentioned that you've had folks that were sort of seasoned at it, and folks who really have had no experience at it at all. So, I think that can kind of be another self-limiting barrier that we have, that we feel like we're not good at it. So, what would you say to that type of individual related to creative writing?
Well, one thing I would just say is that I totally agree that that listening to other people's stories and representations is in itself really inspiring and moving. And so just being present with others in this way, that community aspect where there isn't judgment, like there's great value in that. But as far as the writing process goes, enjoying the process. It's just like, let's just see what this process is like and not focusing on the outcome and not trying to compare your work to others or critique it. We're explicit that we're not here to critique each other's work. It's not that kind of workshop. A lot of folks tell me I just don't interact in the world with the world this way. Like this is a new way of engaging with the world. So just embrace it and like allowing yourself to have that experience, to try out that experience and see what it's like for you. Not worry about the outcome. A lot of times, I'm sure probably Rhonda and a lot of the folks in the workshops, they have the same experience. There's a lot of times I write something in a workshop and I never look at it again, but the experience itself had value. It provided that release I was describing earlier, that sense of play, that sense of becoming, and the value was in that, not in the finished product.
So, kind of doing a modified mini version of this, what prompt would you leave for our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I'll let Rhonda offer one first if she has one.
I do. I'm going to start with just a simple start to a story. It can be a paragraph or longer. Starts with then 6 weeks later. What does that bring to mind? And Eric and I tend to use a lot of prompts, within the workshops we use, but not, I mean, this is an easy one for the podcast because we can say the words. We also tend to use a whole lot of visual prompts within there, music, spoken word poetry, lots of other things that folks can react to. But for this format, we'll go with that one. So then 6 weeks later.
Yeah, and I like that that last point that Rhonda was making is that the way we structure this, and is inspired by narrative medicine actually. We engage with works of art or writing first, and we discuss those and interpret them, and then we write after we do that. So the one you propose, Rhonda, is then 6 weeks
Later.
later. Yeah, I love that. We both like to do prompts where it ends with dot, dot, dot. So mine does as well. The one I thought of just this morning was there are things we hold and things we let go. Dot, dot, dot.
That's good. I'll also include those in written form in the show notes, so that folks can take those and use those as starter prompts to get a feel for it and kind of understand what that release feels like and that creative process using writing. So, do you want to go ahead and tell us about the next creative writing workshop that you have when it's coming up?
Sure. We've got two scheduled for the next 2 months. So we've got a February and a March scheduled. And so February will be on the 23rd from 1 to 2. And March will be on March 28th from 5:30 to 6:30. That one is going to be our first one that we're doing a little bit later. So we're hoping that, for some folks, it's a little hard to step away even at lunchtime or during the middle of the day. So we're hoping that might work well for them. These are both going to be on Zoom. And, as Eric mentioned earlier, no experience required. This is for newbies who have never tried any kind of creative writing or any sort of structured thing like this. And it can also be for folks who are out here teaching this on campus. Come on and join us and have the experience. We would love to have folks join in for that. And as I mentioned earlier, there's always that invitation to share, but not an obligation. So don't feel like you're going to be put on the hot seat, and made to roll out your first thing that you wrote. You can just experience this. You can hear this. You can give feedback, and we will definitely lead you through. Other things you want to mention about the upcoming sessions, Eric?
No, that was well said. Again, I think that just for folks who have not participated previously, it's a very supportive group of people with diverse backgrounds and very diverse lived experiences. But there's just a general sense of, I would say, compassion and care within the group itself. And so it's a warm and welcoming group.
Awesome. Well, I'll put links to those in the show notes as well. Any other resources that you want to mention? Any other books or podcasts or anything that are related to creativity that you think our folks might find value in?
Sure. I've got a couple of things that I wanted to point out, and then I'll see if Eric feel free to join in with my list as well. A couple of books that I really like. One is an old one, but it's still good to me. Is The Artist's Way. I think a lot of folks that have done writing are familiar with that. It's the book and workbook, and it's got these morning pages if you're wanting to kind of get into a writing rhythm. It's a good resource for that. The other one that I really like is just the Wreck This Journal books. I also like, in addition to writing, I enjoy some of the visual drawing side of things. And I think that's a really fun combination where you get to do all kinds of creative outside the box things, kind of given those prompts of that book. Then a couple other places I wanted to mention that I think can be good if folks are looking for other connections. There's certainly just a million online prompts. If you like the idea of prompts for writing, there are just so many. If you look at that, you can find all sorts of categories of those. Some places in person that can be good kind of resources. There's the Lexington Center for Creative Reuse in town. And I don't know if your listeners are familiar with that one, but it's a relatively new project. It's a nonprofit here in Lexington, and folks can bring in kind of overflow art supplies. They sell those at a really reduced rate, but they also do lots of things where you can come in person and just do creative endeavors together with other people. So we were talking about community for folks that maybe are struggling with trying to find a connection in town or find some community. They have open space where you can just come and bring your art project in and work on it. So it's a really good way of kind of getting outside maybe your bubble a little bit, and also again maybe get your hands on some low cost creative supplies. The Lexington Public Library at the East Side branch, they've also got a makerspace there. So that's again another really accessible, low cost option that's out there. Create Now has a makerspace. So again, these are a few different ones that are here in Lexington. I know we've got folks that are out in other counties. I'm not as familiar with what's available in some of our other areas, but at least these are a couple that are here locally. And then just so many good kind of workbooks, coloring books, those sort of things. So it feels like maybe a little overwhelming to think about how do I start from scratch and do something. Maybe start with one of these, kind of creative workbooks or creative coloring books. If you go on Amazon or one of those sort of places, or go to one of the local bookstores, you're going to find some of those kind of options that are out there. And it's a really good way to kind of again prime that pump to kind of get the ball rolling a little bit in this area.
Those are great resources. Rhonda is always delivers great resources. I'll just offer two. Joey Burke, who's a nurse ethicist here at UK, organizes narrative medicine workshops, which are open to anyone that in any way is involved with UK healthcare. So it can be in any role, on any level. And I also want to just say that having participated in a couple of those narrative medicine workshops, that really provided a lot of the inspiration for the creative writing workshops that Rhonda and I are doing. So I have a lot of gratitude for Joey Burke bringing me into that community. And then in terms of a book, there's a journal that I like. It is titled A Year of Zen, a 52-week guided journal. And so I'm just looking, you can find that from used bookstores online for like $5 or $6. And even if you buy it new, it's only about $10. So that's titled A Year of Zen, a 52-week guided journal.
Yeah, Joey's great. I sit on a committee with her, and she offers a lot of value to that committee for well-being as well. So yeah, double shout out there. I'm actually going to toss one in. I don't do this very often. I know I've mentioned the book Rest already, but I just picked one up about a week or so ago on creativity that I've been going through, and it's by the producer Rick Rubin, and it's called The Creative Act, A Way of Being. And it's a bunch of kind of musings related to creativity and how to get into a creative space, or how to think about creativity. So it's a really kind of simple read because you can pick it up at different points. You can jump around. It's not like a story start to finish. So you can pick a quote unquote chapter, which is usually only about 3 pages each. Maybe pick that up and read one a day or so.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, Eric, we kicked off the Wildly Resilient playlist. It's still going. I'm still having people contribute. Since we've already contributed a bunch of songs, I'm going to narrow this one in a little bit and not make it about resilience. I'm going to make this one about creativity. So what song would each of you add that brings about a sense of creativity?
Well, I was going to say I wasn't prepared for this question, but the first song that comes to mind, it would be David Bowie's "Let's Dance."
Good choice. I like it. Mine, I really like story songs, those, to me, these were like super popular when I was growing up in the 70s, little songs were like a whole story. It's just kind of encapsulated in that one song. So mine is Eleanor Rigby. I love the story in that one, and it's such a strange, odd little song, and I just love it.
I used to lip sing that song in front of a mirror when I was like 6 years old, playing a little 45 record of it.
That makes me really happy.
It's such a great song.
Yeah, I was going to add one into this too. Bowie was on my short list, and the Beatles were Paperback Writer was actually on my short list. But I felt like that was a little too cliche for the conversation, but fits in nicely. There's a lot of Grateful Dead already on here. Not all of my doing, but there is one song that I will mention, Terrapin Station, that I think is great for this. It opens up with inspiration, move me brightly, light the song with sense and color, hold away despair. So I think that ties in really well to the conversation that we already had. But I'm going to throw a huge curveball in here, and I'm going to the mid 2000s with Natasha Bedingfield, Unwritten.
Nice.
That was a big jam back in the mid 2000s. And that was still kind of, every time it comes on, I'm like, oh, this is such a good song, kind of get you going. And the lyrics actually go really well with this conversation. So that's the official one I'm going to dump in here.
I like it.
All right, last word. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
For me, it is focus on process, not product. The process is what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think don't be afraid to fail.
Those are good. Really succinct, but kind of hit you right in the feels, I think, when you're thinking about creativity in the conversation that we've just had. So I appreciate you all so much for coming back on the show. Everyone definitely check out their creative writing workshop if that's something you're interested in, if that's something you want to check out as a creative pursuit. Well worth it, even if you don't know if writing is good for you or something that you enjoy. Give it a try and find out. I'll definitely vouch for them. As I said, I've sat through a couple of them, but I'm so appreciative for you all coming on here and sharing your knowledge with me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, Jacob. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacob.
Well, that was another illuminating conversation for me. I enjoy working on these outros because it really makes me think about what I learned and what I also hope you take away from these episodes. I was genuinely surprised at how many connections there were to concepts we've discussed on past episodes. It's going to be hard to top that number of related episodes, which you can find in the episode show notes. At the end of each episode, I also like to encourage you to try one or two things we learned from the conversation. This time, the prompts are built into our conversation. So I encourage you to explore the 2 creative writing prompts that Rhonda and Eric shared and see what comes up for you. If you know that writing just isn't your thing, then I hope you take the time in the next couple of weeks to reconnect with at least one creative pursuit you've lost touch with and see if you can spark that joy, peace, or relief that you may have been missing. Before I hop off, I also want to quickly mention that a transcript for this episode will be coming soon, or may even be available by the time you're listening. Transcripts are currently available for episodes 28 through 30, and you can find those in the respective show notes. And on that note, the show notes also contain links to everything else that we mentioned in the episode, including the 2 upcoming creative writing workshops hosted by Rhonda and Eric, the additional resources to explore, and our playlist on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube Music. I'll also include a link to the HR calendar where you can browse all of their upcoming work life and well-being events from University of Kentucky Human Resources. Until next time, take care of yourself and others, and stay well. Thanks for listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient. a podcast series from University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. The UK HR Health and Wellness team, consisting of certified health coaches, fitness experts, registered dietitians, and wellness specialists, offer a wide range of online and in-person programming to University of Kentucky employees, retirees, and their spouses. If you enjoyed this episode, you can listen and subscribe to future episodes wherever you find your podcasts. Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by searching @UKY Wellness. There, you'll find links to episode show notes and more. You can also email healthandwellness@uky.edu with any questions or suggestions for future episode topics. To learn more about well-being benefits offered by University of Kentucky Human Resources, visit www.uky.edu/HR/wellbeing. Live well.